Let's talk a little bit about ownership and water rights. Okay, water rights. This is a really, really popular area. I've got two questions I'm going to include on this section right here. Water rights is a very important discussion, and you got to know this when you get to the state exam because they got an assortment of questions they can ask when it comes to water rights. Two terms under A and B you want to know for the state exam. One's called riparian rights. The other one is littoral rights. And it's kind of an easy memory aid when you're looking at this because riparian, I like to use the word R or R. You know, if you pronounce the word R, it stands for R, right? Riparian, R. Well, that's going to be associated with water rights that is running water, like rivers, okay, streams, etc. So we're talking about riparian R, running water R, rivers, okay? Littoral, on the other hand, is L, littoral, la, lakes, large bodies of water. These are bodies of water that don't flow, okay? So littoral deals with ownership rights. And you're talking about ownership rights, which is waterfront. Okay, if you're on a river, for example, you've got waterfront rights to the river. Those are called riparian rights. And each state has their revised statute on how the property owner owns either to the center of the river or stream or to the bank. It depends if it's navigable or non-navigable. In other words, boat traffic, no boat traffic. Okay, so riparian, this is waterfront to a river, river, riparian. Littoral, this is waterfront if you got beachside property or you're on a lake, okay? That's called littoral, large bodies of water. So it's kind of, you can develop a nice memory aid, develop a system to kind of correlate those two words. But you want to know those two words when it comes to water rights and ownership for the state exam. Now, the other thing you want to know is how land is gained and lost. How land is gained and lost, okay? Another big section. Again, you have to go back and you got to look at yourself. Do I have riparian rights or littoral rights, depending on what kind of body of water I have waterfront access to or waterfront ownership? But it doesn't matter if it's lake or river. What we're looking at here is how land is gained and lost to waterfront property, okay? Now, the first one is called accretion, okay? Now, the little memory aid I like to do and use for the state exam, and if I see a question like this, is I like to reference it as a credit. If you give somebody a credit, they're in the plus, right? If I credit you with $100, I'm giving you $100. I'm not going to debit, I'm going to give you. So a credit, accretion, okay? I like to kind of associate it with a credit of what? Sand and silt that forms land. So if you look at the picture at the top right, you see the river. See how dirty that water is? Well, the silt and the sand that's in that water is what makes it dirty. It is not soluble. It doesn't go in the solution. In other words, if I take a glass and I pour sand and silt in it and stir it up, it's going to be muddy. It'll stain the water, but it'll be muddy. But then because it's not soluble and it's called inert, inert means it's not soluble. If I stop stirring that glass, all that sediment is going to fall out to the bottom of the glass, okay? And it's going to form a thickness of silt and dirt at the bottom of the silt and sand at the bottom of the glass. That's what happens with the rivers that have the silt and sand in it over time. Now, it's not something we can see with the naked eye. This is over time, like decades and decades and decades. But over time, these bodies of water, they will drop out their sand and silt, and it forms land. The very essence of that sand and silt falling out is a credit to the land it's formed. Now, the land it forms is called the alluvion, which is number 3. That is the land formed due to accretion or a credit of the sand and silt falling out of the water. It forms the alluvion. If you look at the top picture, you can see the inside of that river. You can still see the dirt, dirty water. That's where over time that little beachfront was formed on the inside of the turn. Okay, that's called alluvion. That's what's formed over time. Okay, also the middle picture, you can see on the inside of the middle picture, that bank was formed over time through accretion or the deposit of silt that formed the alluvion. The alluvion is the actual land that it formed. Okay, erosion is pretty simple. Everybody has an understanding of what erosion is. It's just a taking away of the bank. And then you want to see the term reliction at the bottom. Reliction is nothing more than a dry spell, for example, or they open up a dam to lower the water. As water drops from none other source than maybe a dry spell, or they open a dam to a lake, and the water begins to drop, it forms land called the reliction. Again, if you got waterfront property, okay, and that water drops and land becomes exposed, then the property owner gains access to the reliction, or that land is formed or is exposed from the dropping of the water. And then avulsion. Avulsion is a sudden tearing away of land. For those who are in Florida and Louisiana and the other southern states, you may have witnessed and experienced hurricanes over the years, and the marshlands and the delta lands, a lot of those islands, those barrier islands, get moved and pushed away. This is called avulsion. Don't confuse that with alluvion. Alluvion is the land that's formed because of accretion or the falling out. A credit of silt and sand forms the alluvion. Avulsion is the sudden tearing away due to winds, other big natural acts. Okay. So you want to know riparian, you want to know littoral, and then how land is gained and lost. Have a good understanding of this because you're going to see maybe 1 or 2 questions definitely dealing with this. So I got 2 questions with this section. Here we go. Question number 1. Which is not an example of avulsion? So you got to first define what avulsion is. And then you go through and pick the one that's not an example. All right. So again, I look at this question. The first thing I do, I try to answer the question before looking at my answer selection. That's just my technique. It works for me. So if I read the question, I say, which of the following is not an example of avulsion? So I sit back and I'm at the test center now, and I'm not talking out loud, but I'm thinking under my breath, avulsion. Okay, that's we're talking about land, how land is gained and lost, and I'm thinking this out. Okay, I know about erosion, I know about accretion, alluvion, reliction. Avulsion is natural disasters, hurricanes, high winds that move. So I'm looking for something dealing with high winds. I got 3 answers that are examples of catastrophes in that. One of them is not going to fit that. And then I'll go through my answer selection. After a storm, boom, I know that's one. During a drought, the lake dries up. And I say to myself, nope, that's reliction. Okay. Flash flood, boom. Hillside is torn away, earthquake, boom. All natural disaster. Land is suddenly torn away through these natural disasters, but a lake that's dried up is reliction. So answer B. That's kind of an example how I go through these test questions. It builds in continuity, and it doesn't get me pumping the brakes, going fast, slowing down, going fast. I kind of have a consistency. If I learned how to answer questions before I look at my answers, I'm going to be consistent throughout the test, and it brings me through a nice pace, comfortable pace through the test. Okay, it's just a technique I use. Take it for what it's worth. All right, answer B. Very good. All right, here's the next question. Over the last several years, the tide has been depositing silt onto the property along a coastal inlet, increasing the size of the property. This is an example of good. Excellent. Good job. So when I read this question, I read it, and again, I'm looking at, when I read it, I'm looking at several years. The tide has been depositing silt. Right there, keywords. Boom. Depositing silt onto the property. So if I'm depositing silt, I look at that, and that rings a bell called a credit, right? And I associate that, a credit, with the term accretion, right? So we're talking about answer A. Remember, how land is moved, gained and lost. Gained and lost. We can gain land and we can lose land. Here we're gaining land through the deposit of silt. Now, if the question would have said over the last several years, the tide had been depositing silt onto the property along the coastal inlet, which of the following below best describes the land that is formed? Okay. Now, the land that is formed is not accretion, but the land that is formed as a result of accretion is called alluvion. Okay. Be careful. Listen to me carefully. Be careful. Typically, they'll have them separated when it comes to answers. You won't see alluvion and accretion together, but you never know. Okay, these test writers can get real tricky sometimes. So you want to analyze a test question. The depositing of silt. There's your key words. Okay, if the question were to ask, "What's the land called because of this depositing silt?" That's called the alluvion. Okay, so make sure you characterize the test question and answer what they're asking for. Okay, so we're talking about answer A.
For more practice questions, videos, and insight into the state exam, we encourage you to join our free webinar, How to Pass the Real Estate Exam Without Your Real Estate Book and with only 15 to 20 hours of study time. Get registered now at myrealestatetutor.com/exam.